Hey everybody, welcome to our catch-up videos as we try to cover some of the material in the chapter for the last couple of weeks. I know I missed a class and then we had the sensorium late, so I'll be posting 2 videos to kind of help us catch up and continue on with our material in the class. So the first video is going to relate to some of the material in Chapter 2, Our World and How We Know It, dealing with kind of the differences between the brain and the mind, the differences between the influences of, nature, nurture, biology, culture, perception, all those kinds of questions that we have in the context of trying to understand how is it that we as humans understand, manifest, experience religion and spiritual practices. So this material can be a little overwhelming if you've gotten into Chapter 2. You might have not, because we haven't really been getting back into material the last couple weeks. I can't believe it's week 5 now. But what we're looking for is the big picture, the big ideas of what this chapter holds. So focus on the reading sections that I gave you, and hopefully you'll be fine. So one of the big, I think, messages of this chapter is that whole idea of can we understand science and religion together? How does that, nature and nurture thing intersect? Your textbook calls it biological hardwiring and cultural programming. So what do we already come into the world with, and how might that be swayed by the culture that surrounds us? And so you have a couple of pages that talk about that. So we're looking at sensation, perception. Again, we'll go back to the sensorium last week that some of you participated in, and then how we make sense of it all, in the context of cognition. So in reality, the text kind of looks at, this discussion of 5 types of human realities. How is it that we know our world? And so I'll go through these briefly, and if we have time in class, we'll have a little activity trying to kind of figure this all out for ourselves and for the material coming up. So where our universe is made is right in our head. So this is kind of a gruesome picture, but it's pretty much within our brain in terms of how we perceive and understand and kind of get a bigger understanding of everything that's all around us. Is right there, right on top of my head, probably, if you're seeing this video, right? So let's start with the universe, big picture. So there's a discussion that we never will really know the universe. It is just too big to even comprehend. It's evolving, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing. Just like so many things in our lives is in a constant state of change. There's constant and new phenomenon being discovered, new levels of complexities. And so in some regards, our being can never fully quite understand the universe. And I think the whole discussion of origin stories and myths around the world that encompass the universe, the fascination that we often attribute to prehistorical societies and cultures tied to the universe and the cosmos, makes a lot of sense, because it is awe-inspiring. And many times when we talk about religion and spirituality, there is that sense of awe and something that is bigger than us and beyond us. And many times universe is definitely that. So big picture, large scale, macro level, I think that the chapter's message is that it's almost too big to know, and we are often left awestruck. So let's narrow it down. The next type of reality is our species world. So we share the planet with many different species. There you have my mother's beloved dog as an example of canine species. And we think about how our species really influences how we perceive the world and how our reality is focused towards us. We talked a little bit about being primates and being visually focused, and played around with that with the sensorium last week. And so we think about how each species has a particular channel in which they are more focused on, whether it's visual, whether it's olfactory, auditory, and this is going to affect how reality is perceived. So, for example, the the previous picture, if I can go back, you know, most canines have that really amazing sense of smell, that olfactory kind of perception, that sense where you have that kind of really wet nose, you know, always picking up information. If you think about your furry friends that you have at home, think about how they are living in a very different reality than we do, close to the ground, being very aware of so many scents. That's why they kind of go crazy when there's food around, because it's just a heightened awareness. A very different reality where we are more, let's say, visually focused in terms of how we obtain information. So within the species world, we often look at, again, appropriate to the species environmental niche. So going to non-human primates and how they might interpret the world in terms of, let's say, behaviors and interacting. While we have a human language, we've noticed through countless documentaries and studies where there's a whole slew of nonverbal communication that goes on, let's say for chimpanzees, for example, since we have that on the screen. The idea of grooming, of close touch contact, of vocalizations, of setting hierarchy based on display, and we'll look at chimpanzee behavior again in the class, and thinking how that is specifically and uniquely tied to, you know, the chimpanzee species. So the species world is kind of the next level when we think about the more, I think, biological hardwiring in the context of recognizing and understanding our world. The next step is the perceptual world, and that's unique. It's a unique result of our physical or biological hardware and the culture that we're in. So in other words, the individual's perceptual subset of the species world will be unique. The sensorium was unique for each of you. When I read your reviews, a couple of you were a little anxious, a couple of you felt like you saw colors, a couple of you got very emotional, a couple of you were really intense about wanting to know what every item was. And so it was, even though the same thing was happening for everybody, the same music was played, the same sounds, the same scents, maybe not all the items were the same, everybody had such a very different experience. We'll go to the cultural world now, and this is, you know, very fascinating because this is where we really see a lot of variation. Your culture, you know, dictates the social norms of your life. Culture is social. Culture dictates what is appropriate behavior. Culture is where you find values and morals, and you might throw belief in as well. Culture is tied to traditions and customs, to behaviors. Culture is tied to belief systems, like I said. And so think about how your cultural influences how you live and the appropriate parameters and borders of your life. Culture pre-exists you. Your culture, whether you adhere to American culture, as most of us do right now since we live here, was here before you, has been changing and constantly changing. And as we grow up through the process of enculturation, learning our culture, we do this differently. We are influenced by different family members, different types of media, different types of education. Did you homeschool? Did you private school? Did you public school? Did you have parents raising you? Did you have grandparents raising you? Did you have foster parents raising you? Did you have siblings? Were you an only child? Were you allowed to watch TV? Did you not watch TV? All these things affect how we live, even though we're in the same culture. So the cultural world can also be quite unique. We'll finally go to the personal world, and again, this is interpreted through our culture, but also through our own personal experiences and where we come from. So we have kind of a multitude, I think, of influences when we finally get to how we experience our personal worlds. And it's idiosyncratic. It can change over time as we get older. The person I am now, there's still some of the same person I was 20 years ago, but I'm very, very different in many, many ways as well. And 20 years from now, I might see the world completely different as well. Different experiences, loss, children, jobs, marriage, relationships will continue to change our personal world. So it's very unique. So here's like the big overview. We'll put universe aside and we'll spend time thinking about the species in the cultural worlds, kind of how we access the world. And the perceptual and personal worlds are real only to a certain extent. As long as we exist, my view of the world, my reality will be gone when I'm gone. Um, and and that's kind of a unique element in terms of thinking about all our realities. They're finite in a sense, but yet they continue on. Culture will continue on after us. Our species hopefully will continue on after us. And so it's a very dynamic thing. So here's the final, the big picture again, big picture in these chapters, and with a lot of information that we're seeing. Each individual creates a unique view of the world, and no two humans live in the same reality. So likewise, when we think about religion and God, God may look like this to some of you, and you might have grown up with this image of God as the Father, God as a patriarch. God might be this to some of you. This is the horned God. God might be tied to a very naturalistic figure, tied to elements in the natural world. God might look like this to you. In Australian Aboriginal culture, thinking of a lot of the spirits tied to the Aboriginal dreaming or the dream time when the earth was created, and the spirit beings are part of their worldview, their belief, and their cave art. God could look like this to you. I know there's some groups doing Egyptian mythology and thinking about the pantheon of deities. This is Hathor, and this might be, the deity that you look to. God might look like this to you, which is tied to, of course, Hinduism and the pantheon of the Hindu deities, the Ganesha, which is the remover of obstacles. And in Hollywood, God might look like this, right? So again, a variety of elements in terms of our realities. So finally, I gave you the little portion to read of mysticism in chapter 2, often described as the spiritual side of religion, but also tied to looking at human psychology and the mind. And the next lecture video you'll be watching is on consciousness, and I'll talk about mystical experiences a little bit in that lecture and probably in class as well. So I'll leave you with a little tidbit on neurotheology, which I think is just fascinating and something to think about since we are spending some time thinking about brain activity. Understanding how brain activity changes during religious experiences is becoming a growing research in science. And take a look at that. Take a look at some of the science and some of the evidence of how the brain completely changes through states of meditation and religious practice. And you have the examples of the Carmelite nuns and the Tibetan monks in your chapter. I'll also be posting an article on this interesting topic as well. Anyway, that's the first of 2 videos that I'm posting. I hope you enjoy it. Can't wait to see you guys and get back into class materials. Have a great evening, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye.